On the morning of June 14, 1852, in Charleston, South Carolina, a 24-year-old enslaved woman named Sarah was placed on the auction block at Ryan's Mart while 8 months pregnant. The sale proceeded despite her condition, in direct violation of the informal understanding among some traders that women in advanced pregnancy should be held until after delivery to protect property value. Within 2 hours, Sarah went into labor during the bidding process, gave birth on the platform, and named the infant after the highest bidder, a planter named Edmund Gallard who paid $850 for both mother and child. 3 witnesses later reported the incident to church authorities. The auctioneer lost his license for 6 months, and the sale was legally contested but ultimately upheld. Can a society claim moral order while its laws and commerce treat childbirth as a transaction? Subscribe to the Bondage Chronicles for stories that reveal the systems behind American slavery. Now, let's return to where it began. Sarah stood on the raised wooden platform in the center of Ryan's Mart, her hands positioned at her sides as instructed. The auctioneer, a man named Pritchard, moved past her without speaking, checking the line of people waiting to be sold. He stopped at a younger woman 2 spaces down, gestured for her to step forward, then returned her to the line. Sarah did not move. Her back ached from standing, and the weight of her pregnancy made it difficult to remain still, but she had learned that any adjustment, any shift in posture, could be interpreted as resistance or poor health. Both would lower her price. Both would anger whoever owned her next. Pritchard returned to his table near the front of the platform and opened a ledger. He wrote something, closed it, and looked toward the entrance where potential buyers had begun to gather. It was just after 9 in the morning. The auction would not begin for another 30 minutes, but men were already walking the platform, inspecting the people for sale. One man stopped in front of Sarah, looked at her condition, and walked away without speaking. Another asked Pritchard a question she could not hear. Pritchard answered and gestured toward the ledger. The man nodded and left the building. A woman Sarah recognized from the holding pen approached the platform. Her name was Dinah, and she had been held at Ryan's Mart for 11 days. Dinah carried a tin cup of water and handed it to Sarah without asking permission. Sarah drank quickly, knowing Pritchard might object if he noticed. Dinah took the cup back and walked toward the rear of the room. Pritchard did not look up. Sarah's last sale had occurred 3 years earlier in Virginia. She had been sold alone, separated from her mother and 2 brothers at an estate auction after the death of the property owner. The new buyer, a man named Calhoun, brought her to South Carolina to work in his household. Calhoun's wife had recently died, and he needed someone to manage the kitchen and maintain the main house. For 2 years, Sarah worked without incident. Then Calhoun remarried, and his new wife insisted on hiring a free woman from Charleston to run the household. Calhoun sold Sarah 6 weeks ago. She had been pregnant for 7 months at the time. The holding pen at Ryan's Mart contained 14 people. Sarah was the only one visibly pregnant. The others ranged in age from 12 to perhaps 50, though exact ages were rarely recorded. They slept on the floor, used a single privy in the corner, and received 2 meals each day. Guards watched the entrance at all times. Conversation was discouraged but not prohibited. Sarah spoke to Dinah occasionally, and to a man named Isaac who had been sold twice before and knew what to expect from the auction process. Isaac told her that buyers preferred enslaved people sold in groups, families, skilled laborers, field hands who had worked together. Single sales, he said, often meant something was wrong: age, injury, temperament, theft. Sarah asked what buyers thought about pregnant women. Isaac said it depended on the buyer and the price. Some men saw value in purchasing 2 people for the cost of 1. Others considered pregnancy a risk, lost work time, medical complications, the possibility of death. Sarah did not ask what happened if a woman died in childbirth. She already knew the child would still be sold. On the morning of the auction, Pritchard entered the holding pen and called out names. Sarah's name was 4th on the list. He led them through a narrow hallway into the main auction room, then directed them to stand in a line on the platform. Sarah took her position and waited. The room filled slowly. Men entered alone or in pairs, some dressed in formal coats, others in work clothes. A few brought ledgers or papers. Most simply stood near the platform and watched. Pritchard opened the auction at 9:30. He sold the first person, a man in his 30s, within 10 minutes. The second sale took longer. The third person was a girl, no older than 14, who cried when she was brought forward. Pritchard ignored her and continued with the bidding. She sold for $320. Then Pritchard called Sarah forward. She stepped to the front of the platform. Pritchard read from a card that listed her age, her work history, and her condition. He did not mention the pregnancy specifically, but gestured toward her and said she was sold, as is, with increase. Several men in the audience laughed. One man, near the back, shouted a question about her health. Pritchard answered that she had been examined by a physician 2 days earlier and was found fit. The man did not respond. Bidding began at $400. A man in a gray coat raised his hand. Another man, standing closer to the platform, countered with $450. The first man raised again. The price climbed slowly, $500, $550, $600. Sarah stood without moving. Her legs ached. The pressure in her abdomen had been building since early morning, a dull heaviness that made breathing difficult. She ignored it. Pritchard was watching her. Any sign of distress would stop the auction, and a stopped auction meant she would be sent back to the holding pen, possibly for weeks. The bidding paused at $650. Pritchard scanned the room, waiting for another offer. A man near the side wall raised his hand, $700. The previous bidder shook his head and stepped back. Pritchard called for higher bids. Silence. He raised his hand to close the sale. Then a voice from the rear of the room called out $750. Pritchard turned. The man who had spoken was tall, well-dressed, wearing a dark coat and holding a leather folder. Pritchard acknowledged the bid and called for $800. The tall man raised his hand again. Pritchard looked around the room. No other bids came. He lifted his gavel. Sarah felt the first contraction as Pritchard's gavel came down. The pain was sharp, focused low in her back, spreading forward through her abdomen. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them and forced herself to remain upright. Pritchard was writing in his ledger. The tall man, the buyer, was speaking with another man near the entrance. No one was looking at her. She shifted her weight slightly, trying to relieve the pressure. The contraction faded but did not disappear entirely. She knew what it meant. She had witnessed births before, had assisted twice when other enslaved women on Calhoun's property went into labor. First contractions could last for hours before real labor began. She might have time. She might reach the holding pen or the buyer's wagon before the pain became unmanageable. Pritchard gestured for her to step down from the platform. She moved carefully, one foot in front of the other, gripping the edge of the wooden surface for balance. Her legs shook. The room seemed smaller suddenly, the voices louder. She reached the floor and stood waiting for instruction. Pritchard was still writing. The tall man was walking toward her now, his face expressionless. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her without speaking. Then he turned to Pritchard and asked when he could take possession. Pritchard said immediately, once the payment was finalized. The man nodded and handed him the leather folder. The second contraction came while Pritchard was counting money. Sarah gasped, could not stop herself. The sound was quiet but audible. Pritchard looked up. The tall man turned toward her. She tried to straighten, to control her breathing, but the pain was stronger now, tightening across her entire abdomen. She pressed one hand against the nearest wall. Pritchard set down the money and walked toward her. He asked if she was in labor. She did not answer immediately. He repeated the question, louder. She said yes. Pritchard stepped back and looked at the tall man, Edmund Gallard, though Sarah did not yet know his name. Gallard's expression did not change. He asked how long Sarah had been pregnant. Pritchard checked his ledger and said 8 months. Gallard nodded slowly, then asked if the sale was final. Pritchard hesitated. He said the payment had been accepted, the transaction recorded. Gallard asked if the sale could be voided due to immediate medical complications. Pritchard said it could not. South Carolina law recognized the sale of enslaved people as binding once money changed hands, regardless of subsequent health issues. The risk of childbirth, he added, was assumed by the buyer. Gallard did not respond. He looked at Sarah, then back at Pritchard, then toward the door. Sarah's contractions were coming faster now, every few minutes. She remained standing but leaned heavily against the wall. Other people in the auction room had noticed. A small crowd formed near the platform, watching. One man suggested calling a physician. Pritchard said there was no physician at Ryan's Mart, and that moving Sarah in her condition would be dangerous. Another man asked why Pritchard had allowed the sale to proceed if she was so close to delivery. Pritchard said he had disclosed her condition clearly, that buyers were responsible for assessing their own risks. The man who had asked the question walked away, shaking his head. Gallard asked Pritchard where Sarah could be taken. Pritchard gestured toward a small room at the back of the building, used for storage. Gallard looked at the room, then at Sarah, then told Pritchard to send for a midwife. Pritchard said he did not employ a midwife. Gallard asked if there was anyone at the mart who had experience with childbirth. Pritchard called for Dinah. Dinah came forward immediately. Pritchard asked if she had delivered babies before. Dinah said yes, twice on the plantation where she had been held in Georgia. Pritchard told her to take Sarah to the back room and do what was necessary. Dinah nodded and moved toward Sarah, placing one arm around her shoulders. Sarah allowed herself to be led. The contractions were constant now, barely any pause between them. Her legs would not support her weight. Dinah half carried her to the storage room and eased her down onto a pile of empty grain sacks. The room was small, windowless, lit by a single oil lamp. Dinah knelt beside Sarah and asked how long she had been feeling contractions. Sarah said since the auction began, maybe longer. Dinah asked if her water had broken. Sarah said no. Dinah placed her hand on Sarah's abdomen, felt the tightness, and said the baby was coming soon. She told Sarah to breathe slowly, to focus on her breathing, to let her body do the work. Sarah tried to follow the instructions, but the pain overwhelmed everything else. She cried out, could not stop herself. Dinah told her it was all right, that she could make noise, that no one would punish her for it. Gallard entered the room a few minutes later. He stood near the doorway, watching. Dinah did not acknowledge him. Sarah was lying on her side now, gripping the grain sacks, her breathing rapid and shallow. Gallard asked Dinah if there were complications. Dinah said she did not know yet, that first births could take hours or minutes, that there was no way to predict. Gallard asked if Sarah might die. Dinah said it was possible. Any birth carried that risk. Gallard did not respond. He stood in the doorway for another minute, then left. Pritchard appeared shortly after. He asked Dinah if the birth was proceeding normally. Dinah said yes, as far as she could tell. Pritchard asked how much longer it would take. Dinah said she did not know. Pritchard said the auction had to continue, that other sales were waiting, that he could not keep the room occupied indefinitely. Dinah said Sarah could not be moved. Pritchard said he understood, but that Gallard was requesting updates, and that other buyers were complaining about the disruption. Dinah told him there was nothing she could do to speed the process. Pritchard left without further comment. Sarah's water broke an hour after the contractions began. Dinah used the grain sacks to absorb the fluid, then repositioned Sarah onto her back. She told Sarah to push when the next contraction came. Sarah pushed. The pain was unbearable, worse than anything she had experienced. She screamed. Dinah told her to push again. Sarah pushed. Dinah said she could see the baby's head, that Sarah needed to keep pushing, that it was almost over. Sarah pushed again. The baby emerged in a rush of blood and fluid. Dinah caught the infant, cleared its mouth and nose, and held it up. A girl. Alive. Crying. Dinah wrapped the baby in a piece of cloth torn from her own dress and placed her on Sarah's chest. Sarah looked at the child but did not speak. Her body was shaking, exhausted. Dinah delivered the afterbirth, checked Sarah for excessive bleeding, and said she thought both mother and child would survive. Sarah closed her eyes. Gallard returned to the room 20 minutes later. He looked at Sarah, at the baby, then at Dinah. He asked if the child was healthy. Dinah said yes, as far as she could determine. Gallard asked Sarah what she intended to name the baby. Sarah did not answer immediately. She was still holding the child, still trying to process what had happened. Gallard repeated the question. Sarah looked at him directly for the first time. She said she would name the baby Edmund, after him. Gallard's expression did not change. He said the baby was a girl. Sarah said she knew. She would call her Edmonia. Gallard asked why. Sarah did not answer. Dinah, still kneeling beside Sarah, said quietly that enslaved mothers sometimes named their children after the people who owned them, hoping it would provide protection or favorable treatment. Gallard said he had not asked for that. Sarah said she knew. She said it anyway. Gallard stood silently for a moment, then told Dinah to clean Sarah and the baby, and to inform Pritchard that he would return tomorrow to collect his property. He left the room. Sarah remained in the storage room for the rest of the day. Pritchard brought water and a small amount of food, cornbread and salted pork. Dinah stayed with her, helping her nurse the baby, checking for fever or infection. By evening, Sarah was able to sit up. The bleeding had slowed. The baby nursed without difficulty. Dinah said these were good signs, that Sarah had been lucky. Sarah did not feel lucky. She felt numb, emptied. She had given birth in a storage room at an auction house, surrounded by strangers, watched by the man who had just purchased her. She had named her daughter after that man, not out of respect or gratitude, but because she believed, she hoped, it might give the child some small measure of safety in a world that considered her property before she had even taken her first breath. That night, Sarah slept on the grain sacks with Edmonia beside her. Dinah returned to the holding pen. The auction house grew quiet. Sarah woke several times to nurse the baby, to check that she was still breathing, to adjust the makeshift blanket Dinah had fashioned from torn cloth. Each time she woke, she thought about what would happen the next day when Gallard returned. She did not know where he would take her. She did not know what kind of man he was, what he expected, how he would treat a woman who had just given birth. She knew only that she had no choice, no control, no power to refuse or negotiate or protect herself or her daughter. The sale was final. The law was clear. She and Edmonia belonged to Edmund Gallard. Gallard arrived at Ryan's Mart the following afternoon with a wagon and a driver. Pritchard met him at the entrance and led him to the storage room. Sarah was awake, sitting upright with Edmonia in her arms. Gallard entered and told her to stand. Sarah tried, but her legs gave out. Gallard told the driver, a man named Marcus, to carry her to the wagon. Marcus lifted Sarah carefully, supporting her back and legs, and carried her outside. He placed her in the wagon bed, which had been lined with straw and a single thin blanket. Gallard handed Edmonia to Sarah, then climbed into the front seat beside Marcus. The wagon pulled away from Ryan's Mart without ceremony. The journey to Gallard's plantation took 3 hours. Sarah lay in the wagon bed, holding Edmonia, watching the buildings of Charleston give way to farmland and then to forest. The road was rough, full of ruts and holes. Each jolt sent pain through Sarah's body. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. Edmonia slept through most of the journey, waking only once to nurse. Sarah fed her as best she could, bracing herself against the side of the wagon to maintain balance. Gallard did not speak during the trip. He sat facing forward, occasionally giving directions to Marcus. Sarah could see only the back of his head, the stiff line of his shoulders. She tried to gauge his temperament from his posture, his tone of voice when he spoke to Marcus, but learned nothing. He seemed neither angry nor pleased, neither cruel nor kind. He was simply present, a man who had made a purchase and was transporting his property. The plantation came into view near dusk. It was larger than Sarah had expected. Hundreds of acres of cotton fields, a main house built in the Georgian style, outbuildings for storage and processing, rows of small cabins where enslaved workers lived. Marcus drove the wagon past the main house to a cabin at the far end of the row. He stopped and helped Sarah down from the wagon. Gallard descended from the front seat and told Sarah this would be her quarters. He said she was not to work for 2 weeks, to allow her body to recover from childbirth. After 2 weeks, she would be assigned to the main house to assist the cook and housekeeper. He asked if she understood. Sarah said yes. Gallard turned and walked toward the main house without another word. The cabin was small, 1 room, a dirt floor, a single window with no glass, a fireplace built into the far wall. There was a narrow bed frame with a straw mattress, a wooden crate for storage, and a bucket for water. Sarah entered and sat on the bed. Edmonia began to cry. Sarah nursed her, then laid her down on the mattress and covered her with the cloth Dinah had given her. She sat beside the baby, staring at the wall, trying to understand what had happened, what was happening, what would happen next. A woman appeared in the doorway an hour later. She was older, perhaps 40, with graying hair tied back in a cloth. She introduced herself as Clara, the cook. She said Gallard had sent her to check on Sarah and to bring food. She handed Sarah a plate of rice and beans, a piece of cornbread, and a cup of water. Sarah thanked her. Clara asked to see the baby. Sarah lifted Edmonia carefully. Clara looked at her for a long moment, then said she had heard what happened at the auction, that everyone on the plantation had heard. She said it was wrong, what Pritchard had done, selling a woman so close to delivery. She said it was wrong that the sale had been allowed to stand. She said a lot of things were wrong, but that did not change them. Sarah asked Clara about Gallard. Clara hesitated before answering. She said Gallard was not the worst master she had known, but he was not kind either. He cared about productivity, about maintaining order, about the appearance of his property. He did not tolerate disobedience or laziness, but he rarely resorted to physical punishment unless he believed it necessary. He preferred separation, selling people who caused trouble, breaking up families to prevent collective resistance. Clara said she had been on the plantation for 8 years and had seen at least 20 people sold for minor infractions. She said Sarah should be careful, should work hard, should not attract attention. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah recovered slowly. Clara brought food daily and checked on Edmonia. Other women from the quarters visited occasionally, offering advice on nursing, on caring for a newborn in difficult conditions, on managing Gallard's expectations. Sarah listened but spoke little. She spent most of her time in the cabin, nursing Edmonia, trying to regain her strength. The pain from childbirth faded gradually, but exhaustion remained. Edmonia woke every few hours, needing to be fed, needing to be held. Sarah slept in brief intervals, never more than 2 or 3 hours at a time. On the 15th day after her arrival, Gallard sent word that Sarah was to report to the main house the following morning. She arrived at dawn, carrying Edmonia in a sling Clara had made from scrap fabric. The housekeeper, a free black woman named Ruth, met her at the kitchen entrance. Ruth explained Sarah's duties: prepare vegetables, clean dishes, maintain the kitchen fires, assist with laundry when needed. She said Sarah could keep Edmonia with her while she worked, but the baby could not interfere with her tasks. If the baby cried excessively or became a distraction, Sarah would have to make other arrangements. Sarah asked what other arrangements were possible. Ruth said there were older women in the quarters who cared for children while their mothers worked. Sarah said she preferred to keep Edmonia with her. Ruth said that was acceptable as long as the work got done. Sarah worked in the kitchen for 6 hours that first day. She prepared vegetables for the midday meal, washed dishes, swept the floor, carried water from the well. Edmonia slept in the sling for most of the morning, woke once to nurse, then slept again. Ruth watched, but made no comment. When Sarah finished her assigned tasks, Ruth told her to return the next morning at the same time. Sarah walked back to her cabin as the sun was setting. This routine continued for 3 weeks. Sarah worked, cared for Edmonia, slept when she could. She spoke to Clara and Ruth and occasionally to other enslaved workers, but formed no close relationships. She kept to herself, focused on survival, on making sure Edmonia was fed and safe. She avoided Gallard whenever possible. He appeared in the kitchen occasionally, inspecting the work, asking Ruth questions about household management. He never spoke to Sarah directly. She was grateful for this. His presence made her tense, reminded her of the auction, of the moment she had named Edmonia after him. She still did not fully understand why she had done it. Protection, perhaps, or manipulation, or simply an instinctive gesture born from desperation. Then, in the 4th week, Gallard's sister arrived at the plantation. Her name was Margaret. She was younger than Gallard, perhaps 30, recently widowed. She had come to stay at the plantation while her late husband's estate was being settled. Sarah first saw her in the dining room, being served breakfast by Ruth. Margaret was small, delicate in appearance, dressed in black mourning clothes. She spoke quietly to Ruth, asking about the food, the household staff, the plantation's operations. Ruth answered politely, offering no more information than necessary. Margaret noticed Edmonia the 2nd day of her visit. Sarah was in the kitchen, washing dishes, with the baby asleep in the sling. Margaret entered and asked Ruth who the baby belonged to. Ruth gestured toward Sarah. Margaret walked over and looked at Edmonia closely. She asked how old the baby was. Sarah said 4 weeks. Margaret asked her name. Sarah hesitated, then said Edmonia. Margaret repeated the name, slowly, as if testing how it sounded. She asked if Sarah had chosen it. Sarah said yes. Margaret asked why. Sarah did not answer. Margaret studied her face for a moment, then turned and left the kitchen. That evening, Margaret spoke to Gallard. Sarah could hear them through the wall that separated the kitchen from the dining room. Margaret was asking about Sarah, about the circumstances of her purchase, about the birth at the auction house. Gallard answered in short, clipped sentences. He confirmed the details, said the sale had been legal and final, said he had no regrets about the transaction. Margaret asked why Sarah had named the baby after him. Gallard said he did not know, that Sarah had offered no explanation. Margaret said it was inappropriate, that it suggested a familiarity that did not exist, that it could be misinterpreted by others. Gallard said it did not matter, that the name changed nothing. Margaret disagreed. She said names carried meaning, that allowing an enslaved woman to name her child after the master created confusion, implied a relationship that undermined proper social boundaries. She said Gallard should require Sarah to choose a different name. Gallard was silent for a long moment. Then he said he would consider it. The conversation ended. Sarah stood in the kitchen, holding Edmonia, her hands shaking. She had heard every word. She understood what Margaret was suggesting, what Gallard might do. She had named her daughter after him to create a bond, however thin, however imagined. She had hoped the name would make Gallard see Edmonia as something more than property, would make him hesitate before selling her, before separating mother and child. Now that strategy had backfired. Margaret saw the name as a threat, a breach of social order, and Gallard was considering forcing Sarah to undo it. Sarah did not sleep that night. She lay on the straw mattress with Edmonia beside her, staring at the ceiling, trying to think of alternatives. She could refuse to change the name, but refusal would be considered disobedience, and disobedience would lead to punishment, possibly whipping, possibly sale. She could agree to change the name, accept whatever Gallard decided, and lose the small protection she had hoped to create. Either choice felt like defeat. The next morning, Gallard summoned Sarah to his study. She left Edmonia with Clara and walked to the main house. Ruth directed her to a room on the 2nd floor, then left her standing in the hallway. Sarah waited. After several minutes, Gallard opened the door and told her to enter. The study was lined with bookshelves, filled with ledgers and papers. Gallard sat behind a large wooden desk. He did not invite Sarah to sit. He looked at her for a moment, then said he had decided the baby's name would remain Edmonia. He said his sister's concerns were noted but ultimately irrelevant. The name did not imply familiarity or relationship. It was simply a name, chosen by a mother for her child, and he saw no reason to interfere. He told Sarah she could return to her work. Sarah thanked him and left. She walked back to the kitchen in silence, trying to process what had happened. Gallard had allowed the name to stand. He had rejected his sister's demand. Sarah did not know why. Perhaps he genuinely believed the name was meaningless. Perhaps he wanted to assert his authority over Margaret. Perhaps he felt some small, unacknowledged discomfort about forcing a mother to rename her child. Whatever the reason, Edmonia would keep her name. The protection Sarah had hoped to create, real or imagined, remained intact. 3 months after Edmonia's birth, Gallard decided to sell Clara. The decision came without warning. Clara had worked in the kitchen for 8 years, had been loyal, competent, reliable. But she had argued with Ruth over kitchen management, had questioned Ruth's authority in front of other workers, and Ruth had reported the incident to Gallard. Gallard valued order above all else. He told Ruth that Clara would be sold at the next available auction. Ruth protested mildly. Clara was valuable, experienced, difficult to replace. Gallard said he would purchase a replacement. The matter was settled. Sarah learned of the decision from Clara herself. Clara came to Sarah's cabin the evening after Gallard had informed her. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap, and said she would be gone within a week. Sarah asked where she would be taken. Clara said she did not know. Probably Charleston, back to Ryan's Mart or another auction house. Probably sold to someone who needed kitchen help, though there was no way to predict. She might end up on a plantation worse than Gallard's. She might end up in a household in the city. She might be separated from her son, who lived on a neighboring plantation and visited twice a year. She had no control over any of it. Sarah asked if there was anything that could be done. Clara shook her head. She said once Gallard made a decision, it was final. She said Sarah should be careful, should not make the same mistake she had made. Sarah asked what mistake that was. Clara said believing she had any right to speak, to question, to defend herself. She said the only safety for enslaved people was silence, obedience, invisibility. She said Sarah should remember that, especially now, with Edmonia to protect. Clara was taken to Charleston 6 days later. Sarah did not see her leave. She was working in the kitchen when Marcus drove the wagon past the main house, Clara sitting in the back with her hands bound. Sarah watched through the window, but said nothing. Ruth, standing beside her, said Gallard had already arranged for a replacement, a younger woman, purchased from an estate sale in Columbia. She would arrive within the week. The new cook, whose name was Bess, was 17 years old. She had minimal experience, had worked mostly in the fields before being sold to Gallard. Ruth spent the first week teaching her basic tasks, how to manage the kitchen fires, how to prepare the meals Gallard expected, how to clean and organize the workspace. Bess was eager, attentive, but slow. She made mistakes, burned food, forgot ingredients, broke dishes. Ruth corrected her patiently at first, then with increasing frustration. By the end of the second week, Ruth was reporting Bess's errors to Gallard. Gallard did not sell Bess. Instead, he assigned Sarah to supervise her. Sarah was to teach Bess everything Clara had taught her, to ensure the kitchen ran smoothly, to prevent further mistakes. Ruth would oversee both of them, but the daily responsibility would fall to Sarah. Gallard told Sarah this directly, calling her to his study one afternoon. He said he was giving her authority over Bess because he believed she was capable, because she had proven herself reliable. He said if Bess continued to make errors, Sarah would be held accountable. Sarah understood what he meant. If the kitchen failed, she would be the one punished. Possibly sold. Possibly separated from Edmonia. Sarah accepted the responsibility. She had no choice. She began working longer hours, arriving at the kitchen before dawn, staying until evening. Edmonia remained with her in the sling, sleeping through most of the day. Sarah taught Bess how to prepare vegetables, how to season meat, how to time meals so everything was ready when Gallard and Margaret sat down to eat. Bess learned slowly but steadily. By the end of the month, the kitchen was functioning smoothly again. Ruth reported this to Gallard. Gallard made no comment. Margaret, however, had noticed the change. She began spending more time in the kitchen, observing Sarah's work, asking questions about Bess's progress, commenting on Edmonia's presence. She told Sarah one morning that it was inappropriate to have a baby in the kitchen while food was being prepared. Sarah said she had no one else to care for Edmonia. Margaret said that was not her concern, that Sarah needed to find another arrangement. Sarah asked if Margaret could suggest one. Margaret said that was not her responsibility. Sarah spoke to Ruth, who suggested leaving Edmonia with one of the older women in the quarters. Sarah resisted. She did not trust anyone else to care for her daughter, did not want Edmonia out of her sight. But Margaret's complaints continued. She began reporting to Gallard that the kitchen was unsanitary, that Sarah's divided attention was compromising the quality of the food, that something needed to change. Gallard, tired of his sister's complaints, told Sarah to make other arrangements for Edmonia. Sarah brought Edmonia to an older woman named Violet, who cared for several other children in the quarters while their mothers worked. Violet was kind, experienced, but Sarah hated leaving Edmonia with her. She worked through each day in a state of constant anxiety, wondering if Edmonia was being fed, if she was crying, if Violet was too overwhelmed with other children to pay proper attention. Sarah began finishing her work as quickly as possible so she could return to the quarters and retrieve Edmonia before dark. One evening, Sarah arrived at Violet's cabin to find Edmonia screaming, her face red, her body rigid with distress. Violet said she had been crying for over an hour, that nothing Violet tried had calmed her. Sarah took Edmonia and held her, rocked her, tried to nurse her, but the baby would not settle. Sarah carried her back to their cabin, pacing the small space, trying to soothe her. Edmonia cried through the night. By morning, she was hoarse, exhausted, barely able to make sound. Sarah brought Edmonia back to the kitchen. She could not leave her with Violet again, could not bear the thought of her daughter suffering while she worked. Margaret saw Edmonia immediately and demanded to know why Sarah had disobeyed Gallard's instructions. Sarah said Edmonia had been ill, that she needed to be near her mother. Margaret said that was not an acceptable excuse, that Sarah was defying direct orders. She told Sarah to leave the kitchen immediately and report to Gallard. Sarah walked to the main house with Edmonia in her arms. Gallard met her in the hallway outside his study. He did not invite her in. He asked why she had brought the baby back to the kitchen. Sarah explained what had happened the previous night, how Edmonia had cried for hours, how she had been unable to calm her while separated. Gallard listened without expression. Then he said Sarah had two choices: obey his instructions and leave Edmonia with Violet, or continue to disobey and accept the consequences. Sarah asked what the consequences would be. Gallard said she would be removed from kitchen duties and sent to work in the fields. He said Edmonia would be left in the quarters during work hours, regardless of Sarah's objections. He said if Sarah continued to resist, he would sell her separately and keep Edmonia on the plantation. Sarah stood in the hallway, holding her daughter, understanding fully what Gallard was threatening. He could separate them legally, permanently, without consequence. He could sell Sarah to a buyer in another state, could keep Edmonia and raise her as property to be sold when she was old enough to work. The law would support him. Society would support him. No one would intervene. Sarah agreed to Gallard's terms. She returned Edmonia to Violet's care and resumed her kitchen duties. For 3 weeks, she followed the arrangement, working from dawn to dusk, retrieving Edmonia each evening, trying to compensate for the hours of separation by holding her through the night. Edmonia grew quieter, less responsive. She nursed less frequently. Her weight, which had been increasing steadily, began to plateau. Sarah noticed but said nothing. She had no power to change the situation. Then Margaret made a final complaint. She told Gallard that Sarah's work had deteriorated, that meals were being prepared carelessly, that the kitchen was disorganized. She said Sarah was distracted, unreliable, that she should be replaced. Gallard reviewed Margaret's complaints and summoned Sarah to his study. He told her she had failed to maintain the standards he expected. He said he was removing her from kitchen duties permanently. He said she would be sent to the fields starting the following week. Sarah asked what would happen to Edmonia. Gallard said Edmonia would remain in Violet's care during work hours. Sarah asked if she could continue to retrieve her each evening. Gallard said she could, provided her field work was satisfactory. Sarah asked what would happen if her field work was not satisfactory. Gallard did not answer. Sarah understood. The threat of separation would remain constant, a tool Gallard could deploy whenever he chose. Sarah began field work in early November, 7 months after Edmonia's birth. She worked alongside 20 other enslaved people, planting winter crops, clearing land, maintaining irrigation ditches. The work was brutal, physically exhausting in ways kitchen labor had never been. She woke before sunrise, worked until sunset, returned to the quarters covered in dirt and sweat, too tired to do anything but nurse Edmonia and collapse into sleep. Edmonia spent entire days with Violet, surrounded by other children, receiving minimal individual attention. The baby's development slowed. She stopped gaining weight. She became lethargic, unresponsive. Sarah requested permission to see a physician. Gallard refused. He said there was nothing wrong with Edmonia that better care from Violet could not address. Sarah asked if she could reduce her work hours to spend more time with her daughter. Gallard said no. Sarah asked if there was any alternative arrangement that would allow her to care for Edmonia properly. Gallard said she should have considered that before disobeying his instructions about the kitchen. 2 weeks later, Edmonia developed a fever. Violet sent word to Sarah in the fields. Sarah ran back to the quarters without permission, abandoning her work. She found Edmonia burning hot, barely conscious, her breathing shallow and rapid. Sarah held her, tried to cool her with water from the well, begged Violet to send for help. Violet said there was no help to send for. The nearest physician was in Charleston, hours away, and Gallard would never pay for his services for an enslaved infant. Sarah carried Edmonia to the main house. She walked through the kitchen, past Ruth and Bess, up the stairs to Gallard's study. She did not knock. She opened the door and stood in the doorway with Edmonia in her arms. Gallard looked up from his desk. He asked what Sarah was doing. Sarah said her daughter was dying. She said she needed a physician. She said Gallard had the power to save Edmonia's life, and she was asking him to use it. Gallard stood and walked to where Sarah was standing. He looked at Edmonia, at the tiny, fevered body, at the child who carried his name. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he told Sarah to return to the quarters. He said he would send Marcus to Charleston to fetch a physician. He said if Sarah ever entered his study without permission again, he would sell her immediately. Sarah returned to the quarters and waited. The physician arrived 4 hours later. He examined Edmonia briefly, said she was suffering from fever and dehydration likely caused by inadequate nutrition and care. He gave Sarah instructions, fluids, rest, regular feeding. He said the child might survive if these instructions were followed carefully. Then he left. Gallard paid him $30. Edmonia survived. The fever broke after 2 days. Her strength returned slowly. Sarah followed the physician's instructions exactly, reducing her own food intake to ensure Edmonia received enough milk. She worked in the fields during the day but spent every available moment with her daughter, holding her, feeding her, watching for any sign of illness. Gallard did not comment on Sarah's unauthorized entry into his study. He did not reduce her work hours. He did not make any concessions. He had called the physician because Sarah had forced him to acknowledge the situation, had put him in a position where refusing would have been morally indefensible, even by his standards. but he had done only the minimum necessary, nothing more. 3 years later, in the spring of 1855, Edmund Gallard sold his plantation and moved to Charleston. The sale included all enslaved people on the property. 93 individuals sold as a single lot to a cotton merchant from Georgia. Sarah and Edmonia were separated during the transfer. Edmonia, now 3 years old, was sold to a different buyer who operated a smaller plantation near Columbia. Sarah was sent to Georgia with the main group. The separation occurred on a Tuesday morning in April. Buyers arrived at Gallard's plantation to inspect their purchases and arrange transportation. Sarah was standing in the yard with other enslaved people when a man approached and asked which child belonged to her. Sarah pointed to Edmonia, who was standing nearby with Violet. The man said Edmonia would be going with him, that he had purchased her separately. Sarah asked why. The man said children Edmonia's age were valuable, easier to train, less likely to resist. He said Sarah would not be accompanying her. Sarah tried to argue, to explain that Edmonia needed her mother, but the man walked away. Sarah ran to Gallard, who was overseeing the transfer from the porch of the main house. She asked him to intervene, to keep her and Edmonia together. Gallard said the sales were final, that he had no control over how the buyers allocated their purchases. Sarah said he could have prevented the separation, could have specified that mother and child should not be divided. Gallard said he had not considered it necessary. Sarah asked him to buy Edmonia back, to keep her on the property until a buyer who would take both of them could be found. Gallard said he was leaving South Carolina, that he had no interest in retaining any enslaved people. He told Sarah to step back and allow the transfer to proceed. Edmonia was placed in a wagon with 4 other children, none of whom she knew. Sarah was held back by 2 of Gallard's overseers while the wagon pulled away. Edmonia did not cry. She did not call for her mother. She sat quietly in the wagon bed, looking back at Sarah until the wagon turned onto the main road and disappeared. Sarah was transported to Georgia 3 days later. She was assigned to field work on a cotton plantation owned by a man named Harrison. She worked there for 11 years, until the end of the Civil War. She never saw Edmonia again. She made inquiries, when possible, about plantations near Columbia, about children named Edmonia, about girls who would have been the right age. She learned nothing. Edmonia's trail disappeared completely after the sale. After emancipation, Sarah remained in Georgia. She married a freedman named Thomas, worked as a laundress, and had 3 more children. She told them about Edmonia, about the auction house in Charleston, about the name she had chosen. She told them she did not know if Edmonia had survived slavery, if she had lived to see freedom, if she remembered anything about her mother. Sarah searched for Edmonia until her own death in 1889, placing inquiries with freedmen's bureaus, churches, and aid societies. No record of Edmonia was ever found. The Charleston County records contain a single entry documenting Sarah's purchase by Edmund Gallard on June 14, 1852. The entry notes the price, $850, and lists Sarah as female, age 24, with increase. No birth record was filed for Edmonia. No separate sale record exists for her transfer to the buyer in Columbia. The physician who treated Edmonia's fever in 1852 recorded the visit in his ledger but did not note the patient's name. Gallard's estate papers, filed after his death in 1871, make no mention of Sarah or Edmonia. In 1935, the Works Progress Administration interviewed former enslaved people across the American South as part of the Federal Writers Project. One interview, conducted in Atlanta, Georgia, included testimony from a woman named Edmonia Grant, born in South Carolina in 1852. When asked about her earliest memories, Grant said she remembered being taken from her mother as a small child, remembered a long wagon ride, remembered being raised by people whose names she no longer recalled. She said her mother had given her an unusual name, had told her it meant something important, but she could not remember what. The interviewer did not ask follow-up questions. Grant's testimony was filed with thousands of others, cataloged, and stored. It was never cross-referenced with any other records. No connection was ever established.